Good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And I am so pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, The History of Antisemitism on Henry Ford. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. So thank you so much for joining us today virtually. I hope that if you're able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. So you can learn more and get tickets on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So not the chat, the Q&A. That just helps us keep track of them a little bit easier. So today we are so honored to be joined by Hasia R. Diner, Stephen Watts, Victoria Wiesti, and Britt Tevis. Hasia is Professor Emerita in the Departments of History and the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University. She's the author of numerous books, including In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935, and Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. Stephen is Professor Emeritus at the University of Missouri, where he has won numerous teaching and research awards and served as chair of the Department of History. He has written 8 books, including biographies of Walt Disney, Henry Ford, Hugh Hefner, Dale Carnegie, John F. Kennedy, and forthcoming in August of this year, Will Rogers. His articles and essays have appeared in venues such as Newsweek, National Review, Salon, The Nation, and Chronicle of Higher Education. He has made many media appearances, including the History Channel, PBS, NBC, NPR, the BBC, and dozens of radio stations around the United States and in Western Europe. Victoria is a historian specializing in U.S. legal and constitutional history. Her first book, The Farmers' Benevolent Trust, Law and Agricultural Cooperation in Industrial America, 1865 to 1945, was awarded the Law and Society Association's J. Willard Hurst Prize for the best book in legal history and named a Choice Outstanding Academic Book for 1999. Her most recent book, Henry Ford's War on Jews and the Legal Battle Against Hate Speech, is currently in development for film and television. Coverage of her scholarship and her own commentary have appeared in the Washington Post, History News Network, Newsweek, the Huffington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. She has also published numerous scholarly articles. Britt is an American Jewish historian and the Backer Assistant Professor in Jewish Studies in the Department of History at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. So a very distinguished panel. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to our panel.
Thank you so much, Sydney, and thank you for having us here today. I just want to say that I know there are so many panels going on and discussions going on about anti-Semitism in the United States right now, but to my mind, really the best version of those conversations come from historians and come from the perspective of the field of history. So I think to everyone here this evening, great decision on your part coming to listen to a bunch of historians talk about Henry Ford. And I want to begin with kind of a synopsis of who Henry Ford is. Recently, I read a colleague who had a student who confused the actor Harrison Ford with Henry Ford. So just for those people who maybe weren't born in the 20th century, or for those people who have forgotten who Henry Ford is, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind sharing about who he is, where did he get his ideas from? What in his personal history and life explains why we're talking about Henry Ford in the context of a conversation about anti-Semitism? And what was kind of the intellectual environment in which he was reared and he operated?
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with the panel here today. I will begin by saying with some confidence that Henry Ford was not a movie star. So we'll get that out of the way. Henry Ford, as I hope at least many of our in our audience knows, a famous industrialist from the early 20th century who also became something of a folk hero, and tremendous historical impact, I think, on modern American life through developing the Model T automobile, of course, a kind of cheap, sturdy car for the masses, mass-produced with the assembly line. That really put America on wheels in the early part of the 20th century, and really changed America in just about every way you could think of. Our cultural values, our economy, social arrangements, geography, everywhere you look, I think Ford and the automobile, really a tremendous historical force. But Henry Ford, I think, like all great individuals, had their failings. And I think at the top of the list, of course, with Ford is his notorious animus against Jewish people, his anti-Semitism. And to help our listeners get up to speed a little bit on that, just kind of a brief synopsis of this. Ford in the late 19 teens is reaching sort of the peak of his influence. And in 1919, he buys a local newspaper around Detroit, the Dearborn Independent, pours money into it to make it a kind of national media mouthpiece for his views. And the Dearborn Independent sort of moves onto the national stage with his backing. And sadly, the calling card of the Dearborn Independent became a kind of anti-Semitic crusade that Ford launched in that newspaper. And it had the title of the International Jew, the World's Problem, quote unquote. And what unfolded over the next few years was several dozen articles condemning the Jewish influence in American life. One series in 2021, I think the second series was 1923, the third in 1924, if I remember my dates correctly. And in this series of articles, I think most, if not all of which, appeared on the front page of the Dearborn Independent, Ford launched a kind of attack on Jewish people and their influence in American life. He attacked with a kind of series of ethnic slurs and characterizations what Jews supposedly were like. And I actually jotted down just a couple of them to give our audience a flavor here. He said Jews were marked by a marked religious instinct. All of these are quotes. Distaste for hard physical labor, a capacity for exploitation, shrewdness and astuteness and speculation in money matters, appreciation of social position, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, he went on to attack the Jewish influence, in his mind anyway, of that group on American music, on American movies, on American sports and baseball, on the Federal Reserve System, politically, socially, economically, everywhere you look. He relied on this, particularly on something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that I think will be delved into a little more deeply later in the panel. Kind of fabricated document about supposedly a Jewish plot to take over the world. So this, in a kind of nutshell, I guess, is the basis of Ford's anti-Semitism, or at least the expression of it in the 20s that got such national attention and embroiled him in such difficulties. I think the two things that most motivated Ford that you mentioned with regard to his anti-Semitism, one of them was populism. Ford, in a lot of ways, was cut out of the old populist mold of the late 19th century, Wall Street, banks, so on, sort of oppressing common people, particularly out in the hinterland. For Ford, it was Jewish Wall Street and bankers and the like. The second thing that I would note briefly is pacifism. Ford was deeply opposed to World War I, was a pacifist with regard to that conflict, and he was convinced that big Jewish munitions makers and bankers in Europe the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, et cetera, were behind all of this. So his pacifism as well as his populism, I think, at least to my mind, were the two biggest influences that kind of moved him along in this direction. So in a nutshell, that's sort of a brief description anyway of Ford and his anti-Semitic crusade in late teens and 1920s.
Great. So it wasn't so much his car manufacturing, but more so his role as a publisher in and disseminating these anti-Jewish ideas, which he drew from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is of course a text that came to the United States from Russia. Moving to you, Vicki, I know that your work has focused really in depth on the ramifications, the legal ramifications, and also like the communal ramifications of the publication of the International Jew, as well as the articles in the Dearborn Independent. And I'm curious if you could share a bit more, both about the publications with us, as well as the legal ramifications and the diverse responses from the Jewish community to the appearance of this deeply hateful and bigoted defamation that Ford very disseminated so widely.
I'd love to, Britt, and I thank you for the questions that you put to us in advance of this meeting, for helping us to organize our thoughts. I have a few sort of random facts that I hope will make sense in the context of what Steve just told us. Henry Ford bought the Dearborn Independent as he was preparing to take the Chicago Tribune to court over his own libel claims. And those claims related to his pacifism, and the Tribune called him an anarchist and an ignorant idealist. And the jury found that he was not libeled for being called ignorant, but he was libeled for being called an anarchist, because that literally meant blowing up buildings at the time. So they awarded him the mighty sum of 6 cents. So in a lot of ways, what happens with the Dearborn Independent is deeply, let's just say, karma. So I mean, Steve mentioned the first anti-Semitic series that ran in the Dearborn Independent, and the articles were collected into pamphlets. There were quite a few of them, over 90, and published as a set beginning in November of 1920. And the really important thing to remember about the International Jew is that Ford did not copyright it. So there was no legal restraint on any publisher who wanted to reprint part or all of this tract. And Ford could not have chosen a more permanent legacy for himself and as a publisher of hate speech than to license anybody to reprint the International Jew. But I want to talk a little bit about what Britt asked me to deal with, which is the legal ramifications of Ford's career as a hate speaker. There were 2 anti-Semitic series in the Dearborn Independent. One was the International Jew, and the second was, it lasted under a year, and its focus was the agricultural cooperative movement, whose lawyer at the time was a very charismatic young Jew who was out of California and who wanted to apply the California model of marketing agricultural commodities to the rest of the country, to the staple crops. And this attracted Ford's suspicions. And so in April of 1924, the agricultural articles began, and they began by attacking what Ford saw as a conspiracy of Jews to take over agriculture. And it was stated quite explicitly that no Jew had any background in agriculture in the US. And so this, on its face, was an illegitimate intrusion into, the sort of mom and apple pie vision of agriculture that Ford kept with him as long as he lived. And this is the first, well, not the first, the second major source of deep conflict within and between different leaders in American Jewry, the most relevant of whom is the lawyer Louis Marshall, who practiced law in New York, was an expert in immigration law, and argued more Supreme Court cases than anyone else during his generation. But Marshall had really tried very hard to keep people from filing suit against Ford because he didn't want to reinforce stereotypes of Jews as litigious and money grubbing. But Aaron was not at all connected to Marshall, not even professionally. They certainly didn't know each other. And Aaron was not connected to what I think of as the sort of East Coast centered network of people that were running organizations in defense of Jewish people and their rights. So Aaron filed suit. The case goes to trial in 1927. So these events are almost a century behind us. And in so many ways, it seems like no time at all has passed. I tell the story of the lawsuit in mind-numbing detail in my book. But the most important thing about it is that Ford was desperate not to testify. It was clear from what the plaintiff put on in his case that that paper could not use truth as a defense to libel, which is the only real defense to libel at common law. And the other thing, the other body of law that might have applied to this case and didn't, was the sort of infant law of group libel, which developed eventually into what we now know as hate speech regulation. But at the time, only half a dozen states had statutes on their books that criminalized the publication of anything that cast aspersions on any group based on nationality, religion, or religion, nationality, or nation of origin. And Michigan was not one of those states. So Aaron Shapiro knew that if he chose to sue in Michigan, which is where he did file suit, that he could not invoke group libel, and he could not sue on behalf of all Jews for the allegations that Ford had published. And the judge made sure to slam the door on that by ruling all group libel claims irrelevant to the suit. So Ford did not want to testify and arranges a mistrial through a series of increasingly unbelievable events. And then Ford sends emissaries to Louis Marshall in New York asking him to end the lawsuit. Could he please write a statement that would settle the case? And this was so irregular because normally you go to the attorneys for the parties, for the other side, and Ford didn't do that. And Marshall didn't either. Marshall did not represent Shapiro. He didn't ask to represent him. He just went ahead and wrote the apology that was published under Ford's name exactly as Marshall wrote it. So in July 1927, the headlines were all about how Ford had apologized to the Jews. And what's remarkable about that is that Marshall has Ford apologizing for group libel, which is the one thing he was not going to be found guilty of in court. And the apology doesn't mention Shapiro or his lawsuit or any of the individual libels that were committed against not just Shapiro but other Jews in the agricultural series of articles. Marshall was really his goal first and foremost was to make certain the citizenship status of Jews in America. And that is why he wrote the statement that he did. It signified that Jews would fit in, that all they wanted was to be protected as citizens. And Marshall wanted to work on getting the International Jew out of print, but he couldn't do that, even though he tried. Anti-Semitic publishers across the world could not be prevailed upon to withdraw their books just out of the kindness of their hearts, and Ford refused to pay them to do so. After that, the lawsuit, these anti-Semitic publishers brought out more editions than ever, and interestingly, they put Ford's name on the cover of the book. So when you see the International Jew these days, whether it's in print or online, Henry Ford is credited as the author, which, you know, is probably a legal technicality, but it serves, I think, to magnify Trump's role as the sort of founding father of American anti-Semitism.
I think you made me Ford.
What did I say?
Trump, who certainly we can talk later at the end about the influence of
That is not the first time I've done that. By no means is that the first time.
You're leaping toward the future. I will say, besides that, I want to make one other correction, which is about your book, which is absolutely not mind-numbing, but actually fascinating, and something that I have used to teach with, and my students really they always love and debate the content of. And in particular, one thing that I am so appreciative and appreciate that your book captures so well is the internal debate within the Jewish community. At the time that these publications that Ford publishes, the International Jew, which is to say that the Jewish community, there is no the, there are Jews, and there are internal communities, and there are dissenting voices within the Jewish world. And that is something that I think your book really brilliantly brings out, that there's a wide spectrum of responses, not just one response. There's not the Jewish response by any means. But the kind of motioning towards kind of the greater political environment and world in which all of these events are taking place brings me to Hasia. Given Hasia, your expertise both in the field of American immigration history and also the field of American Jewish history, I was curious and hoping that you would share with us your knowledge of how Ford's publications speak to the moment and the time period around World War I, both as far as specifically how Ford it relates to the passage of the 1921 emergency quota laws, which severely limited immigration to the United States, and then the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which made those emergency quota laws, well, actually hardened, made them permanent and even more stringent. So both in terms of how this Ford relates to this xenophobic moment and nativism at the time.
Okay, thanks so much. And again, an honor to be on this panel. So I'm just gonna diverge for 1 second from your question to just piggyback a bit on Vicky's comment. So interestingly about Louis Marshall, a number of years before the Ford moment, the case of Leo Frank, this Jewish businessman in Atlanta who was accused of murdering a young, cute white factory girl, was raging. He was on trial, and a Jewish philanthropist, very wealthy man from Chicago, Julius Rosenwald, wrote to Marshall and said, "Don't you think we should wage a defense of Frank and call it anti-Semitism?" And Marshall wrote back to him and said, "It's not the way to go on Frank's defense." He defended Frank, but it's not the way to go because we will stir up anti-Semitism among those who are not yet infected. So the idea was to avoid a big public discussion about anti-Semitism and rather let the law be the basis rather than this kind of issue of groups. So it's a really fascinating kind of, how do you respond? So in terms of the immigration issue, so I'm going to be, I don't know if it's the odd person out, but I would say the 1921 and the 1924 immigration laws would have been passed without Henry Ford. Okay, and there's no question that his ugly words were out there, and we can assume, we don't have a lot of data, that people read it and said, he might be right. Okay, we can't know that, but we know that the nation was on a course towards immigration restriction, starting, well, we can even go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but I think the benchmark is 1917, the 1917 Immigration Act, which, while it did set up the Asiatic barred zone, for Europeans, it was not based on national origins, but it created new categories of, I don't know, lunatics or epileptics or anarchists or whatever, who would be excluded, and it called for a literacy test. Okay, which Wilson, in fact, vetoed, but it was not nationally based. Now, what makes 21 and 24 dramatic change is that those introduce national origins categories. So the quota system based if you're from Bulgaria or Belgium or wherever, show up in 1921. So obviously something has happened between 17 and 21. Okay, and I think the big thing that happened was World War I, and the American I don't know, sense of kind of disillusionment. We went into this war and we lost so many young men, and what did it bring us? But more than that, what it brought us, okay, first was a depression in 1919. Okay, and then by 1920, as the war settled down, as the aftershocks of the war settled down, immigration spikes. Okay, because it had been repressed during the war. I mean, there was no shipping, there was no migration, so on, and the immigration spikes in 1920. Okay, and so that was a kind of, shall we say, moment of concern for many Americans who already were on the path towards thinking the nation had too many immigrants from too many different places, who were of such backgrounds that they were unlikely to ever become good Americans. Okay, the other thing that happens, 1919 was a year of unbelievable number of labor strikes. Okay, the Boston police, the Boston telephone operators, the LA streetcar workers, the Great Steel Strike, the coal strike. In Seattle, there was actually a general strike. It was one of the first times there was a general strike in the United States. And again, many middle-class Americans were taken aback. I mean, why is the nation being engulfed in this level of labor agitation and labor violence? And obviously this takes place just 2 years after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the creation of the Soviet Union. That anti-immigration sentiment, which had been wafted through American society from the late again, can say even from the mid-19th century onward, and was taking a more substantial form, was very much abetted by the post-World War I agitation of the American society. I'd actually like to suggest for some younger historian who wants to try their hand at this to actually look at the impact of the influenza epidemic. You know, and how that, it was the Spanish flu, and it was brought home by guys who had been in the military overseas. And it would be a great project for somebody to follow up on. So now I want to mention again a couple other factors which make Ford, however noxious, and I have not a good word to say for him. I would say he was a monster, that make him less of an actor here. And so, for example, the second Ku Klux Klan, okay, which like the first Klan of the Reconstruction era, targeted African Americans. Okay, but what's notable about the second Klan, which was founded in 1915, 1920, okay, again, the year that this all begins, was its heyday. It was its greatest organizing moment in terms of the numbers of people it recruited. It was as much against Catholics and Jews. Okay, and immigrants in a kind of general sense. And it was a very different Klan than the Klan of the Reconstruction era. Indeed, to Vicky, I would say that Indiana was one of the hottest places for the Klan, but New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire. So this was a very different kind of Klan, and it was pressing for getting rid of the foreigners. Okay, the Catholics and the Jews. And so this is, and again, it was very respectable, notably. The Klan marched in full regalia at Woodrow Wilson's funeral in 1922. The air was full of this. The great historian John Hyam in 1956, in his still absolutely classic book, Strangers in the Land, referred to the 1920s as the tribal 20s. Okay, it was the period where there was such a reaction against immigrants, and he ties it to intellectual trends. He ties it to again, this reaction of the white native-born, whatever that means, that their society is being taken away from them. It's almost like a kind of iteration of the replacement theory that we hear about right now. And in fact, there's a book that comes out in 1920 by Lothrop Stoddard calling The Rising Tide of Color, which said, look, they're taking over. Okay. And it's not Jews, although he includes Jews, but it's, basically not white, non-white people. So I, in a way, pay homage to John Hyam so long ago, seeing this as the tribal 20s, of which Ford was not a cause, but an exemplar.
Well, I find that answer to be very, very convincing, that he's a reflection and not he's not spearheading the passage of these very restrictive immigration laws, but really just reflecting back this wider xenophobic culture that's the result of these labor strikes and the flu and the World War I, and kind of this rising and of course racial tensions that of course have been in America since the get-go. Okay, Steve, Stephen, I have a second round question for you, which is about your work on Henry Ford and your book, which kind of, in its broadest strokes, makes the case that Henry Ford, is the American 20th century in many ways. And if that's the case, if Henry Ford is kind of like the defining person who will be, 500 years from now, the person remembered from that century, what does that say about anti-Semitism in the United States? What does it mean that Ford could be so successful and apparently manipulate the legal system, as he saw fit, and escape kind of serious repercussions for his, truly damaging behavior and actions?
Well, that's a very good question, I think. In my assessment as Ford's biographer, I think Ford's kind of towering influence, his status as a folk hero almost in the early decades of the 20th century, I think basically had to do with the automobile and how the automobile changed people's lives, especially working class and middle class people. And according to those people, made it a lot better in a lot of ways. And, I may be, perhaps the others on the panel will disagree with me, but I've always been a bit heartened in a peculiar sort of way by the Ford anti-Semitic crusade and the reaction to it, in that I'm pretty convinced that Ford's was successful and his reputation grew despite his anti-Semitism and not because of it. When I was doing the biography, even after the early 20s, I read dozens, probably hundreds of newspaper pieces, magazine articles, and letters from people and the like about why Henry Ford is a great man, why Henry Ford has moved the country along in wonderful ways. And it's hard for me to think of any of them really said, well, this wonderful man and these wonderful things I love because of his anti-Semitism. I think most of the time people, well, extremes of right and left, I would say, at least in my judgment, sort of embrace what he had to say. But I think most people sort of rolled their eyes about Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, and they were sort of relieved when the legal case fell apart, when the Dearborn Independent really ceased publishing this stuff, and they sort of went on. So I guess in my vision of things, Henry Ford's 20th century is something that really happened not because of his anti-Semitism, but despite it. And the stain that it made on his reputation, I think, is something that a lot of people in the middle part of the country, both ideologically and geographically perhaps, sort of wanted to go around or wanted to go beyond. They just didn't buy it very much. So others may disagree, but that's always been my judgment about this.
Vicki, I also want to ask you about thinking about anti-Semitism more broadly, and specifically thinking about anti-Semitism in the United States and the law. And you have told a really fascinating legal story, and I'm just curious what you think the potential is for the role of law and its potential for being a tool, and whether or not you do think it's a useful tool or potentially useful tool for people who are interested in minimizing discrimination and bigotry.
Well, theoretically, absolutely, it could be, and in some cases, it is the only resort that people have. But our First Amendment jurisprudence is also stuck in a century-old idea, in Louis Brandeis's idea of the free speech as a market of ideas. And the stalwart liberals and the extremely conservatives on the court ever since have not disagreed about that fundamental rule. It's very difficult to define what hate speech is these days. I think the Ford case, needed far too many circumstances to be different for it to have a legal impact on subsequent attempts to regulate the dissemination of hateful ideas. I think I would respond to Steve's point about Ford being admired not for his anti-Semitism, but for all of his other things. I would say it's because anti-Semitism was so broadly held. The ideas that surfaced in the protocols that that Jews intend to take over the world, and they'll do it through the instruments of the financial system and the press. Those were so commonly accepted, and in some ways still are. But during the 20s and 30s, that is what I think a majority of Americans did believe. And I did read quite a few letters that Ford got while he was publishing these articles, and most of them were fan letters. There were very few not connected to agriculture that said, please stop, you're embarrassing yourself. I think if there's going to be a new legal formulation for how we would preserve free speech, while at the same time recognizing what my old teacher Jeremy Waldron calls the harm in hate speech, it's going to take a reconsideration of First Amendment jurisprudence that I know the Legal Academy is not interested in undertaking, and it doesn't appear to be happening in the federal courts these days. So there's some support for bringing back group libel as a meaningful legal concept. The Supreme Court actually upheld a group libel statute that came out of Illinois in 1953, the case of Beauharnais versus Illinois, and then handed down the New York Times versus Sullivan case 10 years later that held that newspapers could not be sued for libel just because an individual didn't like what was published about them. So ever since then, legal experts have said, well, Beauharnais is effectively overruled. And the court does that quite frequently, overrules without explicitly saying so. But so I think it's worth exploring. And I really did hope the book would lead to that conversation of whether we can reanimate group libel and make it a meaningful concept so that people can feel that they can get protection from the courts and from legal authorities.
My thought when you were speaking was the Supreme Court not upholding precedent? No. Not this Supreme Court. Just kidding.
Not the Supreme Court, indeed.
Hasia, in preparation for tonight, I read an interview that you did, and I learned for the very first time, I didn't know that one fan of Ford's was Hitler, Adolf Hitler, who apparently, and I was wondering first if you could gesture and just share, your knowledge about that relationship and intellectual inspiration, I suppose. And then and some thoughts really about like in a longer term way Ford's influence.
Right. So the Ford-Hitler connection, Hitler looked to the United States for all sorts of precedents and for elements from the American contemporary and historic scene in the United States. So what Ford had to say worked absolutely perfectly for Hitler's sort of ideas that were articulated in Mein Kampf, which comes out just a few years later. And yes, the idea of, the international Jewish conspiracy, and that Jews there's a cabal of Jews who are running the world for their own benefit and to the detriment of, in his case, real Germans, and that it behooved real Germans to understand the dangers in which they lived. Ford actually gets an award from the Third Reich. So it was not, and it wasn't like a friendship, but there were some really close connections. Now, it's also interesting that the Nazi regime used America's Jim Crow laws as a model for the Nuremberg laws. So there's a real interesting connection there. Now, in terms of the long range influence, I think what I'd like to just in the probably 2 minutes I have, speak from my area of expertise, which is American Jewish history. And so having written several books that cover the period of time, it is really interesting how often Ford's name came up in the Yiddish press, in the English language Jewish press. Whenever a Jew did something that was noble and selfless for somebody else, they'd say, see, this is a message to Ford. Okay, so there's a little piece in the American Israelite in the mid-20s where Julius Rosenwald, and I'll quote him only because I wrote about him, rescued an African-American business by giving them the funds when they couldn't get a loan anyplace else. So the article in the American Israelite in capital letters said, here's one for Ford's folly. And this is, a 100% Jew, okay, did what no 100% American was willing to do. So they kept using this over and over as a kind of yardstick. And it was a yardstick of how frightened they were that there were forces at work in America that seemed to be growing, that were going to, in some ways, shake them out of the status they had acquired. And also, though, to praise America, say, look at Ford was this evil guy who said these terrible things, and he was put in his place. Okay, and therefore the system works. So he is a reference, again, throughout the long period of time after the protocols affair, and well beyond his lifetime, for what does it mean? What does anti-Semitism mean in America? And you can read that story in two ways. And you can read it on the one hand, my God, this really happened, and this person was dominated had such kind of a large public persona. On the other hand, they could say, look, he said what he said, and our rights actually increased. Okay, so there's no right or wrong, but rather he becomes the yardstick.
What I'm hearing from you is that Ford lived rent-free in the psyche of American Jewry.
Very good.
perhaps still does in many ways. We are now, this is the time now to move to Q&A, and I looking for the questions that we're going to be asking. Okay, so one of the questions, and I think I'm going to read a few of them, and then you please feel free to respond to what moves you. Did Ford's anti-Semitism influence his philanthropic work in any way? The next question notes that Ford was a champion for hiring African Americans. Did he hire other minorities? Did Jews work for Ford? Did he have a quota for minorities? Had Ford suffered any perceived personal slight or financial setback by Jews? Which I think is another way of asking, was there a legitimate reason why he might dislike Jews? I'm going to throw in my own question there. My grandpa, who turns 100 in just a few weeks, keeps telling me, and he is born in Detroit, tells me that Ford was mad at the Purple Gang, and he's always saying the Purple Gang, which is, to be honest, I think involves like a Jewish mafia.
Jewish bootleggers.
That's right. Yeah.
1920 is also the Prohibition Amendment. And so this was a group of Jewish thugs who play, and he was a temperance guy. He was a prohibitionist, and they played a really important role in bringing illegal liquor from Canada into the United States through Michigan.
So my grandpa claims that was Ford has a big beef with Jews because of apparently, I didn't realize that he was a prohibitionist. So that makes actually a lot of sense. Good job, Grandpa. And then also there was another question about whether or not there was condemnation of Ford by non-Jews. And I'm going to throw in my last question to this group, which is about kind of, again, this longer term inspiration. I know that historians who look at the post-World War II era and look at like the third iteration of the Klan, and this white nationalist literature that emerges in the 1960s and 70s, it will reprint Ford articles and say, remember what Ford told us, and then excerpts from the Dearborn Independent and from the International Jew. I personally have encountered excerpts of it on Instagram, which I then report to Instagram, and then Instagram tells me this does not violate our terms of use. We're sorry, we're going to leave this up. And so I'm just trying to think if we can think really about projecting forward to our modern moment, if Ford has any responsibility for where we are now. Okay, any or all of those. I'm going to start again with Stephen, and maybe 2 minutes each. 3 at most.
Right. Well, there were a lot of questions there. I'll grab the one about African Americans, because when I did the book, I found that quite interesting, that African Americans in the Detroit area were big supporters of Henry Ford because he hired them in his factory. And he did not personally seem to have the kind of animus against Black people in the country that he did against Jews, obviously. And it's kind of interesting that in the 30s, when Ford turned so anti-union, when he was fighting the New Deal and the National Labor Relations Board and all of that, that African American workers stood by Ford to the final to the final barricade, practically in those disputes. So it's a kind of interesting and odd juxtaposition of attitudes about race and ethnicity with regard to Ford. The other thing quickly about if there was any personal experience that Ford had, he never said so, and I was unable to find anything that he had any direct sort of incident or even read something that seems to have prompted this. Ford was an ignorant man, very poorly educated, and he did things by hunches, as he used to call them. And I think in some strange way, the anti-Semitism sort of flowed out of this kind of visceral hunch-like attitude toward the world that he had. And there doesn't seem to have been anything, at least that I could find, that directly motivated him to those kinds of attitudes in his personal life about Jews.
I wanted to go back and pick up what Steve said about Ford being influenced by late 19th century populism. And I think, and no Ford biographer would disagree that those were the ideas that that were sort of the ambient environment when Ford was coming of age in the 1890s. And I agree that that there's no evidence that Ford was aggrieved in some personal way. In fact, he was very proud of pointing out that the architect Albert Kahn designed the River Rouge plant, and that his best friend from the days that he lived in Detroit was a rabbi who famously returned the gift of a car in 1920 when Ford would not respond to him or take down the articles. That's the sort of defense of, some of my best friends are that I think we pretty much debunked as a kind of tokenism that really has no meaning when it comes to what allies should do when confronted with hateful ideas and hate speech. So the other thing I want to say about populism is that a lot of people during the teens and 20s thought that Ford was having trouble getting loans from banks. And in fact, he did not need loans from banks, but he allowed people to think that that was a symptom of Jewish control of money in this country. When he lost his suit to the Dodge brothers, instead of paying them, instead of issuing stock to them as he was supposed to, he simply bought them out and took the company private. So he had resources that he was able to draw upon. And I should stop there so that Hasia can chime in.
Okay, so again, so many questions. So on Ford and African Americans. So while African Americans worked in segregated units in the Ford plants, they got a good wage compared to most other places, and he was a hero to them. And it was certainly one of the spurs for the Great Migration to Detroit in particular. So ironically, or if not ironically, in like 1923, there was a little bit of a flurry about running Ford for president, and a group of African Americans, I'm not sure who they were, issued a statement about how much they would support Ford for president. And so again, the Jewish publications went absolutely berserk about this. And they said, this is how the people we have been helping are paying us back by supporting Ford for president. Don't they know what an enemy he is to us? So, and now the philanthropy, let me say, he was one of very interesting little, again, I guess mine are all ironic. In the mid-1960s, the Ford Foundation, which had nothing to do with Ford at that point, but it was still the Ford Foundation, financed the experimental community control school district program, creating community controlled school districts in New York. And it led to one of the most intense strikes, the Ocean Hill-Brownsville school strike, which pitted Jews against Blacks. And at a point when many Jews were in fact really turning to a kind of neoconservative mode, they're saying it was the Ford Foundation. There's a reason it was Ford that's behind this effort, because many Jewish teachers had been fired from the school. So that's kind of, he's the gift that keeps giving. He hired, certainly one of the famous things about Ford in the pre-1920s is that he had these forced Americanization classes for his workers. And he had spies who would sneak around to see if the immigrant workers were speaking English or not. And they would pay visits to immigrant workers' homes to see if they were like living like Americans. And many historians have written about this grand ceremony that was held yearly in Detroit, where the immigrant workers who'd gone through the Americanization class would kind of march onto the stage in their so-called immigrant garb. Obviously, it was, all costume, and they would march across the stage behind what looked like a kind of paper mache cauldron, i.e. the melting pot, and they would come out the other end in their Ford uniforms, carrying an American flag, and get their citizenship papers. So the idea was that, this is this kind of ideal of a homogenous America, of which Jews kind of continued to be Jewish, and therefore were thorns in his side.
Doctors Diner, Watts, and Weisty, thank you so much. There really is nothing I can think of that's more fun than hanging out with historians and listening to all the amazing historical information they have to share. So this was really a pleasure for me. Thank you. And now back to Sydney. And thank you also to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for hosting us.
Yes.
Thank you.
I have to agree with Britt. There is nothing cooler than hanging out with historians. So it's also been a pleasure to listen to this discussion. And Britt, I want to thank you for putting together all of these questions. And I want to thank the rest of our panel for taking the time to be here with us today. And I also would like to thank everyone who joined us out in the internet verse for being here with us. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mghnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mghnyc.org/current events.